All right, hello, History 362. So up till now, we've been largely focused on kings. Philip II, Alexander the Great, his successors, who by the end of the 4th century are referring to themselves by the title of king, Basileus. This week, we're going to look at cities, particularly the Greek city-states, the polis, singular polis, and their interactions with these great kings. And here, it might be worth sort of thinking about this a little bit in terms of continuity and change. If I had taught this course, let's say 50 years ago, the sort of take that I probably would have given you that was very, very standard, say, in 1970s and before, is that the world of the city-state, the Greek city-state, the Greek polis, effectively ended at the Battle of Chaironea, when the coalition of Athens and Thebes and other affiliated city-states are defeated by Philip II and his son Alexander. And then that's, for all practical purposes, the end of the city-state as a truly autonomous, dynamic political force. That while certainly these cities continued afterwards, they were simply kind of truly subordinate organizations of the great kings. Now, on one hand, when we think about the differences between, say, the 4th century and the 3rd century, without question, the presence of powerful kings who can overawe any one city-state, and actually have a pretty darn good shot of overawing even a coalition of city-states. The realities of those kings and the kinds of interactions that cities have to engage with these kings who control military and fiscal and political power that is beyond what any one city-state can muster, that certainly defines, at least for me, the world after the 330s BC, the presence of powerful Hellenistic kings. That is something that's changed, even though the Greek city-states had, throughout the 5th and 4th century, had to deal with one powerful king, although a distant one, namely the king of Achaemenid Persia. But the Hellenistic kings are quite close. If you are a city-state in Asia Minor, the Seleucid king is right there. If you are and of course I should note, if you've been a city-state in Asia Minor, you've been a subject of the Persian Empire prior to Alexander the Great. But if you're particularly the city-states in mainland Greece, whereas the Persian king has to launch these incredible expeditions that tend to fail because they're launched from such a distance, the king of Macedonia is right there. And that's really the big change in what geopolitics looks like, particularly in mainland Greece itself. So today I think we'll just talk a little bit about city-states, and we'll focus briefly on one city-state, arguably one of the most important and influential and culturally potent city-states, Athens, and what the wars of the successors, the kind of narrative that I've given you from the point of view of the kings, what that looks like from the point of view of Athens. But first, it's important to note that the Greek city-state, the polis, a fundamental way that Greeks organized themselves kind of since at least the 7th century BC or so, these polis are incredibly diverse. They run the gamut from a very large polis like Athens. Athens, at its peak in the 5th century, may have had a population of upwards of 250,000 people, maybe about 60,000 adult male citizens, but then women, children, slaves, and so that's a lot of human capital right there. But many Greek city-states, even in the 5th century, are quite small, 1,000 to 5,000 people, which we'd consider that a pretty small town. But those actually, the majority of Greek city-states, and they actually did an inventory. How many Greek city-states were there? How many polis were there? And they counted about 1,000 in the whole Greek world, that is running from Asia Minor all the way to southern Italy and Sicily. And again, there's a handful of big ones: Thebes, Athens, Sparta, city-states that are actually capable of being kind of international players. But most city-states weren't like that. And actually, we should remember, in terms when we also think of continuity and change, certainly for the big, powerful city-states like Athens and Sparta, they go from being international players who are autonomous, who are capable, who have a tremendous amount of agency in at least in the Aegean, to being, admittedly, yes, subordinate powers whose agency is heavily constricted by the military and economic power of the kings. That happens without question, and in the terms of Hellenistic geopolitics, it's one of the big changes. But that being said, for many Greek city-states, things don't change other than the master, right? Many of these small city-states had always been subject to the hegemony either of another city-state, including the big ones like Athens or Thebes, or of other powers, including for many in Asia Minor, the Persian Empire. So again, it's not like there was sort of everyone was free in the 4th century before Alexander, and now all of the Greek city-states are subjugated. Many Greek city-states go from being subjugated, oftentimes to another powerful city-state, to subjugated to a Hellenistic king. And there may not be that much change in the practical ramifications of sort of who's the dominant power next door. Nonetheless, these city-states all continue to function. Many of them, in fact, the 4th century, one of the sort of political developments is democracy becomes quite widespread amongst Greek polis. Maybe not as radical a democracy as is practiced in Athens, but the Greeks will kind of come to see democracy as coinciding with autonomy. That to have a modicum of autonomy means having an assembly in which citizens can come together and vote and make decisions on the part of the community. That's perhaps as widespread in the 4th century as it is going to be, 4th century going into the 3rd century, as it's going to be in the Hellenistic world, even as the Athenian democracy itself takes a big hit in the agency that the demos has now that Athens is going to be under the thumb of the Hellenistic kings. Now let's go ahead and just sort of consider Athens during following Chaeronea. So following Chaeronea, Athens is forced to join the League of Corinth. It contributes, in particular, ships for Alexander's expedition. But the Athenians are not, there is actually an internal reaction to this devastating defeat at Chaeronea. And the Athenians, over the course of the 330s and 320s, engage in what, say, political scientists might call internal strengthening, trying to rebuild, maybe not explicitly or openly, but I think without question, strengthening vis-a-vis Macedonia, even as they are now forced allies of Macedonia. And this project, the figure most prominently associated with this project is an Athenian named Lycurgus. He notably has the same name as the great Spartan lawgiver, folk hero, kind of mythic figure. But Lycurgus of Athens is given a sort of set of powers. We're not quite sure what office he has to exercise these powers. He's given a surprising amount of superintendence over Athenian finances, and it seems that he actually rebuilds Athens' fiscal base so that it can finance potentially military operations. There's some evidence, although this is contested, that he also reforms the ephebes of Athens. So traditionally, young men, as they are about to turn 18, will spend 2 years engaging in military service. They'll go and man the forts and strongholds along the Attic border, and they are the ephebes. This is the closest thing Athens has to a standing army. The rest of the army is sort of a part-time citizen militia that hoplites, heavy infantry muster, and then go home. But there's sort of this crew of young men that keeps sort of the border forts permanently manned. Now, up till now, it seems that this is sort of a voluntary thing. Men who are wealthy enough to leave their farms and spend 2 years away become ephebes. They have to provide their own equipment, so that also requires a level of wealth. But that also means that there's only so many young men who can afford to do this. There is some evidence that under Lycurgus, ephebes are for the first time issued their equipment. They've actually found some tokens that suggest that you would be given a piece of equipment. There would be kind of a token to symbolize this for accounting purposes. And so this may mean that more Athenian young men are able to staff the army. But even if some of the details are debated, overall, under Lycurgus, Athens emerges as a much more robust entity from what had faced the Macedonians at Piraeus. So the Athenians actually, rather than sort of being in permanent decline, are quietly strengthening themselves. Even though in 331 they do not join the Spartan revolt, when the Spartan king Agis III revolts in 331, the Athenians are on the fence and they say, we're cool. And this allows Antipater to take a force, go down to Sparta, subdue the Spartans, and then force them to finally join the Corinthian League. That's their punishment for the revolt. That being said, late in Alexander's life, a couple of things really make the Athenians unhappy. One is the Athenian possession of Samos. Alexander tries to take that away from the Athenians. And also, Alexander sets out a decree across Greek cities saying that those cities need to readmit anyone that they've exiled. And the people that the Athenians tend to exile are anti-democratic, oligarchic politicians. And the Athenians don't necessarily want that back. So there's already a lot of tension stewing and brewing with Athens when Alexander dies. And therefore, the Athenians pounce on this unanticipated opportunity to try to throw off the Macedonian yoke. And of course, the sort of Athenian power, rebuilt Athenian power, catches the Macedonians under Antipater off guard. And the war that ensues, the Lamian War, briefly sees the Macedonians besieged by the Athenians and their allies at Lamia. So the Athenians, for a while, looks like they have the upper hand. And the Athenians, however, lose in a kind of freak occurrence when a large column of time-expired veterans, about 10,000 men, are returning back to Macedonia. And these veterans, under a commander named Piraeus, are able to, basically the emergence of these sort of pike phalanx guys who have been fighting under Alexander for a decade, that ends the war. So the Athenians are again crushed. And this time the power, the thumb of Macedonia is going to be much heavier than it was in the 330s and 320s. So after the Lamian War, the Macedonians demand that the Athenians turn over or execute themselves a number of anti-Macedonian politicians. The leading victim, who ultimately is killed in flight, is Demosthenes. Demosthenes, who had been a major rhetorical, advocating for a really hardline policy against Philip II during Philip's rise, and then again during the Lamian War had emerged as a strong, stark anti-Macedonian voice. But so Demosthenes flees and is then killed. And to this day, Demosthenes is sort of associated as this orator who is a voice of democracy and freedom. In the aftermath of the Lamian War, the democracy sort of technically exists, but the Athenians really are basically forced to collaborate with the Macedonians. And indeed, if there's a political difference in Athens, it's sort of in what style will you collaborate. So on one hand, there is an orator named Demosthenes, who basically is in favor of shameless collaboration, being a complete Macedonian toady. The opposite end of that spectrum is represented or embodied by a general and orator named Phocion, sometimes called Phocion the Good, who still advocates collaboration, but tries to be at least a little more staid and measured and reserved, and maybe push back a little more when you can. Now, interestingly enough, this ends badly for both men. Demosthenes is a complete and total toady, and yet he is going to be executed at the behest of Cassander when it's revealed that he had been having secret correspondence with Perdiccas before Perdiccas's untimely death in the Nile, and so again, it's, for all his toadying does him no good. Phocion is unfortunate in that Polyperchon briefly moves on Athens in 318 BC with an army, and with his army reinstates a number of pro-democratic exiles. And in this period, Phocion is condemned along with a number of his supporters for being a Macedonian collaborator and executed by being forced to drink hemlock. Now, Polyperchon is an interesting case. Remember, he had wanted to be the regent of Macedonia, been appointed by Antipater after Antipater's death. He'd been forced out by Cassander, Antipater's own son. And in his conflict with Cassander, he needs to rally as many Greek city-states to his side in order to have their support. And therefore, he comes up with a slogan, a very important slogan, because it's going to be repeated again and again and again throughout the Hellenistic period. And the slogan is freedom for the Greeks, the idea that Greek cities deserve to be autonomous and self-governing. And so this is one reason why Polyperchon, when he briefly controls Athens in 318, tries to reinstate the Athenian democracy in kind of full force. Again, it had never been truly dismantled, but the idea that it was now going to be truly free to make the decisions it wanted to make rather than waiting for instructions to come from Macedonia. This rallying cry is going to be picked up by various successors and subsequently various Hellenistic kings. Even if it's often honored in the breach, Greek cities like the idea of kings paying lip service to the concept of freedom for the Greeks, the concept that Greek cities should be autonomous. Although, as we'll see this week, autonomy is itself oftentimes a vague and nebulous concept. Now, Polyperchon only controls Athens very briefly. By 317, Cassander has retaken the city. And he decides that now he wants to end the Athenian democracy for good. He installs a personal tyrant named Demetrius of Phaleron, an Athenian citizen who actually is, by training and avocation, a philosopher, but who is willing to govern the city as a sort of puppet autocrat. And Demetrius will govern Athens for 10 years, although again governing on behalf of Cassander, until Demetrius Poliorcetes takes the city in 307. Demetrius flees, goes to Alexander, and plays a somewhat moderate role in the foundation of the library of Alexandria. But now Demetrius is the master of Athens. On one hand, the Athenians are actually pretty grateful. They hadn't really liked Demetrius of Phaleron, and Demetrius has a much lighter hand Demetrius Poliorcetes has a much lighter hand than Demetrius of Phaleron. We're entering the point in Hellenistic history where there are too darn many Demetriuses. Suffice to say, Demetrius Poliorcetes is not a democratic figure. The Athenians actually let him set up shop, set up like a living quarters in the Parthenon, and he turns the back of the Parthenon into kind of his own private sex den. Even as the Athenians say, compose hymns praising him for freeing the city and keeping it safe. And these hymns are the kinds of hymns that you would otherwise sing to a god. Now, after the Battle of Ipsus, the Athenians have a bit of a change of heart. And they kick Demetrius out. That said, Athens very quickly falls under Cassander. Nature abhors a vacuum. Cassander moves in, reinstalls a different tyrant named Lycurgus. But Demetrius comes back in 294 as he's successful in also obtaining the throne of Macedonia. And Athens is really going to be an Antigonid possession within that family until 229 BC. And the way that the Antigonids, unlike Cassander, Cassander had a thing of like, I'm going to install my own man as governor and he will rule the Athenians. The Antigonids don't do that. What they do instead is put up a garrison. The big garrison is going to be in the Piraeus, the port at Athens. So there's a big Macedonian garrison. And therefore, even though the Athenians may still have their ecclesia and they can still come and make decisions, their ability to act contrary to Macedonian wishes are quite constricted, given that there is now a large garrison of Macedonian soldiers that control the key strategic port. They can, in theory, choke off the food supply to the city. And Piraeus is only about 10 miles from the city proper. So that garrison will now be how the Antigonid kings will exert their control over Athens, although there will be, as we go down the line, there will be a couple of moments where Athens rises in rebellion, particularly in the 260s. But the garrisoning of cities by kings is actually an extremely common way of controlling them without necessarily trying to govern them directly. And indeed, paradoxically, as Greek cities come to define, well, what is freedom? What is autonomy? What is democracy? These things can oftentimes be seen to happen in a city, even if it has the garrison of a king. So that's sort of just the beginning. Next time we'll talk a little bit more about how kings can control and interface with cities. So I will see you all more this week.